Welcome to Ufahamu Africa, a podcast about life and politics on the continent. I'm Kimmy Dion, one of your hosts. For this week's episode, we're focusing on the conflict in Sudan. We're sharing a panel conversation on Sudan's current events that was recorded on Thursday, May 4th. Panel moderator Mostafa Minawi is a director of Critical Ottoman and Post-Ottoman Studies at the Einaudi Center and an associate professor of history at Cornell University. Ufahamu Africa is grateful to the Critical Ottoman and Post-Ottoman Studies group and the panel for agreeing to have this panel recorded and shared with our listeners. The first panelist is Mai Hassan, an associate professor of political science at MIT and faculty co-director of MIT Africa. She was also our guest in episode 137 when we spoke with her about her award-winning book, Regime Threats and State Solutions. Earlier this week, Mai Hassan co-authored with Ahmed Kaduda an essay in Foreign Affairs titled Sudan's Generals Are Dragging the Country Toward Disaster. Only civilian leaders can forge a path to peace. That essay provides an excellent overview of what is at stake in this conflict and its urgency. Next on the panel is Nisrin Elamin, an assistant professor of anthropology and African studies at the University of Toronto. 5 years ago, when Professor Elamin was still in graduate school, she co-authored with Zachariah Mompili a compelling essay about protests that started the 2018-2019 revolution in Sudan. Even though it was quite early, that piece was prescient in distinguishing those protests as something more than what we've seen in the past. I've been following her work and have learned so much about Sudan and beyond from her since she wrote that essay. Rounding out the panel is Deen Sharp, an urban geographer and visiting fellow at the London School of Economics who is based in Sudan's capital city of Khartoum. He was quoted in a recent piece published in Nature that I recommend to our listeners, in which Miriam Nadif interviews 3 researchers working in Khartoum faced with the uncertainty, violence, and tragedy of the ongoing conflict. As always, you can go to our website to find links to the pieces we've mentioned and learn more about the panelists. Now, let's turn to their conversation.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to this important webinar. I'm thrilled that many of you are able to join us, and I'm thrilled that we're able to put this together so quickly. And I'm very, very grateful to the speakers who were able to find time, again, very last minute, to come together to talk about this incredibly important and timely issue. My name is Mostafa Minawi, and I'm the Director of Critical Ottoman and Post-Ottoman Studies here at Cornell University. And I'm also an associate professor of history at Cornell. Before I introduce our speakers and the topic for today, I would like to thank the Einaudi Center for International Studies for their continued support and for their, of course, sponsorship of this event. I also want to acknowledge the co-sponsorship of the Institute for African Development, the REPI Institute, an African Studies and Research Center here at Cornell University for their for co-sponsoring this event and promoting it. I think for most of us, what's happening in Sudan does not require any introduction, but I will give a very, very brief background. So when we jump into the discussion with the experts, for those of you that haven't been following it too closely, you'll have some background. The fighting broke out in April 15th after weeks of tension between the army and a powerful paramilitary group that is known now as the Rapid Support Force, or RSF. Both groups used to be allies, and together they seized power in 2021 in a 2021 coup. After, of course, there was a negotiation for a civilian government that was a transitional government after the revolution in Sudan. The tensions increased over a proposed integration of the RSF into the military. The key question is who is in control, and who would be the military commander in chief during the integration period. Most of the fighting is occurring in the capital, Khartoum, but clashes are also reported across the country. We know that at least 500 people, most likely, which is an underreported number, at least 500 people have been killed, thousands injured, and hundreds of thousands have been displaced and are seeking refuge in neighboring countries or farther afield. The international response to the developing crisis, particularly the humanitarian developing crisis, has been inadequate, to say the least. And Western media's attention seems to begin and end with the evacuation of Westerners from the country, which is why I felt it is very important for us to talk about what is taking place in Sudan for the Sudanese people, with scholars and activists committed to Sudan. That's where I would like to introduce our really esteemed panel. They will each give a 15-minute intervention. They're all from different disciplines, so we'll have different perspectives on what's happening in Sudan right now, and then we will have about 15 to 20 minutes of questions and answers, or a discussion. First, I would like to introduce Dr. Mai Hassan, who is an associate professor of political science at MIT and the faculty co-director of MIT Africa. Her first book, Regime Threats and State Solutions, Bureaucratic Loyalty and Embeddedness in Kenya, was selected as Best Book of 2022 by Foreign Affairs, and it won the American Political Science Association's 2021 Robert A. Dahl Award, and was the recipient of the African Studies Association 2021 Bethwell A. Ogot Award. I'm thrilled. Professor Hassan, the floor is yours.
Thanks so much for that introduction, and thank you for everyone who's in attendance. This is, obviously a very, very tragic event. And one of the things that I've been thinking about a lot is, the outbreak of this conflict. It has fundamentally, aside from the huge humanitarian costs, is fundamentally derailing a really important and much sought after democratic transition. And so one of the things I'm thinking about is, when the smoke clears, when a negotiation is signed, when things maybe hopefully start to get back to normal, what are the hopes for a civilian-led political dispensation? How are we going to get back on track? What needs to be done so that democratization can return to Sudan? And one of the things that I've been thinking about a lot is how, obviously, the people who are to blame are the Sudan Armed Forces and the Rapid Support Forces, the SAF and RSF, the belligerents in this conflict. At the same time, the civil society landscape that Sudan was in wasn't the most conducive to really compel these two actors to kind of stay in the barracks. And what I'm talking about is, especially, in the past 4 years during Sudan's political transition, there's been a growing disconnect between and fragmentation of civil society. On one hand, we have formal civil society, what we tend to think of as named groups. So here I'm thinking about Sudan's opposition political parties. Here I'm thinking about labor unions, formal women's groups, and the like. And then on the other hand, we have the grassroots. And here, this is really epitomized in Sudan by the neighborhood resistance committees, or the resistance committees more generally. And there's been this growing fragmentation ever since the 2019 uprising. And it's just really come to the forefront in recent years. And I've been trying to understand why. And this tension has always been there. Ever since the Bashir regime, the formal civil society groups, political parties, labor unions, they hadn't really been able to mobilize large swaths of civil society before the uprising. And that's in large part precisely because they were formal, precisely because they were identifiable, precisely because the regime knew who to co-opt, who to coerce, which groups to infiltrate. And so because of that, they effectively neutered many of these formal civil society groups that had been putting up formal organized resistance to the regimes. And civilians recognize, these people are smart. They don't want to be coerced. They don't want to join illegitimate organizations. They recognized this and then ended up stopped joining many of these formal opposition groups, stopped formally following them. And so then, let us not forget that when the actual uprising began back in 2018, 2019, it actually started in the peripheries without any real organization. And it was eventually organized and led by a trade union. But before December of 2018, before it took to the forefront, that trade union had been largely unheard of. And instead, many people were still organizing, but not in like a hierarchical way. We ended up seeing a lot of these neighborhood resistance committees that were just very, very flat on purpose, because they recognize that once you start formalizing, once you start getting a structure, once you have hierarchy, that's when you become identifiable to the regime and become able to be repressed by the regime. Anyways, these two groups of civil society, two different arms of civil society that had been both like independently pretty much resisting the regime, had clearly mutual interests during the uprising and came together under the banner of the Forces of Freedom and Change, overthrew the regime. But we would say that it wasn't that difficult for these groups to come together during that time, because it's what in political science we call it was a negative revolution, where obviously the hatred for the Bashir regime was very deep, but there wasn't a real vision about what a post-Bashir Sudan would look like. And instead, the main goal was just, let's just overthrow a regime and then we'll figure it out later. And so after Bashir actually was overthrown, when it came time to engage in negotiations, that's when this tension between formal civil society on the one hand and the resistance grassroots committees on the other really started coming to the forefront for various reasons. In thinking about who actually carries out negotiations, the group that was at the bargaining table were the leaders of formal groups, the leaders of these hierarchical groups. Many resistance committees weren't invited to join negotiations in a very real way. And so then these politicians, these leaders of named formal civil society groups, they negotiated with the military leaders that ended up overthrowing Bashir and who are at war today. But whether it's because they are pragmatic, if you want to look on the bright side, if you want to give them the benefit of doubt, these politicians have dealt with the Bashir regime before and dealt with military men before, and so we were being pragmatic in making compromises. Or whether they have personal ambitions and we're trying to figure out a settlement that would help them run as politicians in the future, I'm not sure. They were willing to make compromises with elements of the former regime during the negotiated transition. But the grassroots, the real resistance committees that had really done much of the mobilizing during the uprising, they were much more idealistic and started recognizing that, if you negotiate with the regime, you're still giving them a leg up. They're still going to be in power, and they're going to use that negotiation to try to shape the narrative in a way that or shape the settlement so that it's more conducive for them to return to power. And so these resistance committees who weren't at the table, were idealistic and didn't want any kind of compromise. And so then, because of that, they stopped supporting many of the civilian politicians that were negotiating on behalf of civilians. And so because of that, there was this growing disconnect between civil society. And this was clear to observers of Sudanese politics. And it was also clear to the military men that were on the other side of the table. And so when Burhan, when Hemeti and leaders of other rebel groups launched the 2021 counter-revolutionary coup, what we saw, one of the things that helped that happen is because they recognized that the civilians that they were negotiating with had really lost a lot of grassroots support, and they didn't have the same mobilization power that they did before. And so one of the things that I've been thinking about a lot is when this civil war, it's tricky what to call this conflict, but when this war does end, and it's going to end with some kind of negotiation, some kind of settlement, how do we ensure that those who are actually at the table really represent civilians in the broadest possible way? And in the past, these informal, very flat resistance committees had been excluded in part because for very pragmatic reasons. How do you negotiate with a flat structure? How do you negotiate with 500 resistance committees all across Sudan? How do you know what they're advocating for? Who is the leader who can speak on behalf of all of them and speak on behalf of the group? And I'm not sure how to do that. I'm not sure how you actually get civilians, how you get the representation of these resistance committees in a meaningful way at the bargaining table, but that's what really has to happen. And I think when we think about the negotiation, once these people are at the bargaining table, and as long as they're really treated like senior partners in the negotiation, I'm really hopeful that we're going to look back at this war. It's obviously a very huge humanitarian, needless violence, but only just a small blip in the road to Sudan's broader democratization. So I'm gonna leave it at that. But just as a recap, and thinking about how this conflict is going to end, and in thinking about the hopes for a civilian-led political dispensation in the future, I think we really have to focus on how it is that we can get true grassroots representation at the bargaining table when negotiations are being made, when peace settlements are being hashed out, because it's very clear from pretty much the beginning of Sudan's political transition after the overthrow of Omar al-Bashir in 2019, that if you give power to military men and ask them to quote unquote craft a transition and then to give up power later, that's clearly not the smartest move. Many in Sudan would have told you that from the beginning, but whether for short-term reasons or pragmatic reasons, that's what the international community was pushing. But that just fundamentally can't continue if we really do want Sudan to democratize, and events like this to be squarely in its past.
Thank you very much, Mai. Hopefully we'll have some time at the end to elaborate more on this when we ask you questions. Second, it's my distinct pleasure to introduce my colleague and my friend, Dr. Nisrin Elamin, who is an assistant professor of anthropology and African studies at the University of Toronto. She is currently working on her monograph titled Stratified Enclosures, Land, Capital, and Empire Making in Central Sudan, which focuses on Saudi and Emirati land grabs and community resistance to land dispossession in the Gezira region of Sudan. Professor Amin, the floor is yours.
Yes, thank you so much. I have to apologize in advance that I have a bit of a throat issue, so I have a bit of a hard time speaking, but I just kind of want to follow up on what Dr. Hassan was saying, and maybe start a little bit kind of with the current situation in Sudan, just so people are aware of that. I just evacuated from Sudan. I arrived in Toronto a couple of days ago, and was sheltering in place like thousands of people in Khartoum. I've also been in close touch with a friend in Niala, Darfur, who's thankfully been able to return to her house, but also had a very kind of harrowing experience sheltering in place. And I guess one of the things I want to say is that as we were evacuating, we evacuated using public transport. It's actually incredibly expensive to get out of Khartoum at the moment because there's a shortage of fuel and because the banks are closed. So it's for a lot of people, it's actually almost impossible to get out. Most people don't want to get to the borders necessarily, Ethiopia or Egypt, but they want to get to safer places within Sudan. And there are definitely plenty of places within Sudan, especially in the northern part, Shimaliya, and also some eastern parts that are safe. And so, as we were getting out, we got on this bus, last seats on a bus going to Atbara from Khartoum Bahri, where literally as we were driving through this bus station, we were seeing just missiles strewn all over the floor. The market had been completely burnt out. We were still hearing gunfire, even though it was supposedly a ceasefire. This was during Eid. And so that's, one thing for people to know. Whenever a ceasefire is announced, it's kind of a misnomer. They're continuing to fire. It might be a little bit less, but it is still very dangerous to be moving about during that time. So people are having to make this very difficult decision of, do I shelter in place where it's, not only dangerous, but increasingly unsustainable because electricity has been cut in many places, water has been cut. The neighborhood that we were sheltering in place in is called Hillat Hamad. It's in Bahri, across the river from the Republican Palace. And the RSF has been embedding themselves in that neighborhood for almost a year now. And they've sort of taken over pretty much. They've occupied people's homes. Most people have evacuated, but my own relatives, some of them are still there. And their electricity and water has been cut from day one. And the people who are coordinating kind of life-saving support for them and many others are the neighborhood resistance committees. And so as we were, on this bus trailing, trying to get out of Khartoum, we got stopped several times, as everybody does, by the rapid support forces. They're pretty much in control of Khartoum. In my experience in Khartoum, have not seen a single Sudanese armed forces person or soldier. And so as we were stopped, people were getting pulled off the bus, all the men, and searched. An RSF soldier got close to us, came towards us and said to the other soldiers, "There are fighter jets approaching, you need to get out." And so they left, and our bus driver kind of jumped behind the wheel and started basically moving in the direction that we were hearing the fighter jets coming from, because the choice was, do you go back to Khartoum and potentially get hit, or do you kind of get ahead of this? And I mentioned this because what had happened was that there was a very long convoy of UN vehicles with foreign nationals, embassy staff, and NGO staff that were being evacuated at that moment. And the rapid support forces had essentially escorted them to the border of Khartoum state, then handed them peacefully over to the Sudanese armed forces. And as soon as that handover happened, the fighting resumed. And, there were two questions in my head there, right? One was, there's an entire infrastructure of international aid agencies that is currently evacuating at a time when we need critical support. I mean, this is like, over, I think, a week and a half in to this kind of humanitarian disaster. And, to me, it was like, what is happening? People need food, medicine, they need the support right now. Of course, I understand people want to get to safety, but there's got to be a plan B here for also getting assistance in. And the other point that I want to make here is that the international community, in this case, Europe and the United States and others, have clearly been able to use their leverage selectively to get these forces to implement a ceasefire for themselves, right? For the evacuation of foreign nationals, however short that might have been. And to me, what we were asking is like, why aren't you doing that for the rest of the country, for everybody else who's staying here, right? Who's stuck, basically. And I think part of what my message is that, at least this is from my opinion and from what I've, speaking to other people who are part of resistance committees, who really are providing the kind of, they're providing the life-saving work right now of, emergency medical relief and distributions of food. I mean, people are setting up shelters for domestic workers that weren't able to leave their neighborhood. They're, filling the vacuum that was left behind by these international aid agencies in a very sophisticated and, coordinated way. And, for me, the question here is not, do we need more international intervention? I think we have too much international intervention in Sudan, right? And so for me, the closing of borders is a form of international intervention. I think the way that the RSF was funded by the European Union through the Khartoum process to essentially become border control for the Europeans, that's a form of international intervention. The fact that the RSF and the SAF, we have credible reports that they're getting fuel and weapons from in the case of the RSF from Libya, in the case of the Sudanese armed forces from Egypt. And there are other external actors here, the Emirates and Russia on the RSF side, that we need to. This is definitely not an externally orchestrated war. I also want to make that clear, but it is certainly being, supported by external actors who have had their tentacles in Sudan for too long. And then there's, of course, also these two generals that control aspects of the Sudanese economy that they should not be controlling, right? Like the gold trade in the case of Hemeti and the RSF, and in the case of the Sudanese armed forces, the military owns 250 companies that were supposed to be handed over, to a civilian-led transitional government before the coup happened, and that's I think partly what factored into that. And so, they're able to there's an inflated budget of 70% that goes to the military essentially in Sudan. So all of these things, I think, are, these are internal and external factors. And going back to this point about international intervention, what we need at the moment is a coordinated international response through multilateral agencies that allows for, corridors of humanitarian assistance to get in. We left with a ship that was provided by the Saudis. There were many ships that came afterwards, and none of them had food or medicine for days. I mean, I think the first shipment arrived a couple of days ago. I don't understand that, How can you get an entire warship or, huge ship into the port without thinking about bringing in supplies, So I think that is a form of, action in its denial in a way that needs to stop. We need also safe routes out for people. There needs to be the kind of support for people. There's so many people, including people in my own family, that either, that say they don't want to leave or they can't leave. And it's really about the fact that it's extremely expensive to leave, right? And that's heartbreaking that, even for us in a diaspora, that we can't send the support necessary to get my aunt and uncle out. And so, and I also want to again emphasize, we need to not only focus on Khartoum. I think there's a huge kind of shock factor here where people have never experienced this in Khartoum in the way that people in Darfur and other parts of the country have experienced this before. And so we need to also keep our eyes on these other areas of the country, that have sort of also been neglected in the international media. And specifically, again, the story that Dr. Minawi brought up earlier. I was shocked when I got to the US that the focus was on the evacuation of foreign nationals. Individual stories of people that, like myself, had made it out. That is not the story here, And focusing on that means that the cycle then will quickly move on. And that's also very dangerous because we need the eyes on Sudan to put pressure. At the moment, for me, the first step is let's, leverage the international community's power really to get these generals to cease fighting. I think, what May was saying, Dr. Hassan was saying earlier, I agree, I think the resistance committees have been sidelined. They also refused, right? Because to them, negotiating with war criminals, let's be clear, Hemeti and Al-Burhan have blood on their hands. These are criminals that have committed war crimes that span decades in Darfur, South Sudan, other, parts of Sudan. They are not to be trusted, and we've learned this over and over again, right? Anytime we get closer to the signing of an agreement, something like, a coup or something like this happens. And so to me, I don't know what the solution is. I don't feel as a diaspora person that it is up to me to come up with that solution. I think that needs to come from the people most impacted on the ground. We've maybe come too far to, some people might say that, but I actually think that the only realistic way out is to not put these two generals on the negotiation table ever again. They need to be tried for their crimes, in a Sudanese court. Now, how that happens, I don't know. And, you might call me naive, but I think, if anything, we need to recognize that the people who have been called unrealistic, who have been calling for a full transition to full civilian rule from the very beginning, they're the ones that we need to be listening to because they've been right all along. Thank you.
Last but not least, I would like to introduce Dr. Deen Sharp, who is an urban geographer focused on the Arab world and a visiting fellow at the London School of Economics. He has lived in Khartoum since April 2022. His home in Amarat was shelled on the third day of the conflict and is now occupied by RSF. Thankfully, Deen and his family were away at the time of the conflict and no one was hurt. Deen has published several studies on the processes of urbanization in the Arab world with a specific focus on urban protests and conflict. He is the co-editor of Beyond the Square, Urbanism and the Arab Uprising and Open Gaza, Architectures of Hope. Dr. Sharp, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and thank you, Dr. Hassan and Dr. Elamin, for your comments. And before maybe I launch into some of the urban dynamics drawing from my own scholarship and what's been happening, and I hope to give the attendees some insights into those aspects. I just want to reiterate some things that were said. And firstly, that this movement, this pressure that is needed to stop the violence now. Like I think it's on all of us to write to senators, to politicians, to spread awareness, to keep eyes on Sudan and create that pressure any way we can. Because as someone that has studied the Syrian conflict quite intensely, I mean, I am deeply, deeply worried that this is going to be a long, protracted conflict. The Security Council was split, the international community and international actors are deeply involved, but at the same time, as Eleni was also touching upon, they're also standing back a bit and letting SAF and RSF tear themselves apart. And as I'll explain in a bit more detail in the urban dynamics, the disastrous consequences for the civilian population, for the infrastructure of Sudan, is immense. And I'm deeply, deeply worried that this will turn into a protracted conflict like we've seen in Syria with devastating consequences. And Sudan has this remarkable civil society that Dr. Hassan was detailing, of which are proposing solutions and has that ability to really construct a future for Sudan that is one that fulfills the aspirations and needs of its people. So on the one hand, there's never been a better opportunity to establish this civilian government. But at the same time, this just disastrous and merciless conflict has to stop. And that I only see with immense pressure from the international community to create that sort of scenario where these murderous thugs are not allowed anywhere near a negotiating table. But to go into a bit of what I wanted to say today, I'm an urban geographer, and as Mostafa noted, I moved to Sudan in April 2022. And my work really focuses on the urbanization of the Arab world, and an aspect of this is really focused around the urbanization of conflict. This looks at how urban planning, infrastructure, and materials such as concrete can really be embedded within conflict and weaponized. One of the edited volumes I'm working on at the moment is around how reconstruction processes are very much part of the conflict in Syria and its ongoing and protracted nature, and also looking around how concrete and cement have really become weaponized. So I was on holiday when this conflict broke out. I was due to return on the 18th. And on the third day of this conflict, I got news that my house was shelled, and that then blew into my living room and the windows upstairs. I was on the phone to the landlord just yesterday, who's also based abroad and is finding it difficult to get information from the neighborhood, because and myself as well, knowing many of the neighbors, because everyone has left. I mean, this is Amarat, which is, where many foreign nationals live, but also many elite Sudanese. It is a more wealthy part of the city. And these are many people that have been able to get out. But these houses, and I've had confirmed from friends that RSF are taking over this neighborhood and looting houses and effectively occupying the neighborhood. But I wanted, especially for those that maybe not so familiar with Sudan, to just give some oversight and perspective around where the conflict is happening and how, and importantly, with urbanized nature. you see Khartoum, which has been the epicenter of the conflict, and certainly in its opening weeks, but also especially in the west of the country, in the Darfur region and the cities of El Fasher, Niala, and Al Junaina, which have really had a lot of brutal scenes of violence and looting and burning of civilian areas. So it's important to know that this war, might, like many conflicts of the late 20th and early 21st century, are very much what us urban geographers have been identifying as a new military urbanism that is rapidly getting quite old now and ever more violent and destructive as core periphery relations, uneven geographical development, and the complete disregard for human life reach ever new levels of extremity. Now, I was just seeing on Twitter, for instance, that hospitals are increasingly getting targeted. The Omdurman Midwives Hospital, one of the largest in the country, is reporting that the RSF have looted and taken over, and many other hospitals are reporting similar sorts of incidences. ACLED, which is an organization that monitors conflict, has noted that 2/3 of fighting between SAF and RSF are in cities with 100,000 people or more in the country. And, we've really seen, again, like key roads, airports, and other key infrastructure sites are really becoming the sites of conflict. And indeed, this the first spark was up in Merowe Airport. And now I suspect as Port Sudan becomes a hub of the movement of people and goods, we're going to be seeing a lot of nervous eyes around how the conflict, if it does shift, or they're there, and I very much hope it doesn't, and that there are movements to ensure that that area is protected, because a lot of the humanitarian goods now, I think we are going to start to see rapidly get through there. And I've already heard reports that, it's coming through, and that even the ministries and the government of Sudan are able to access that because of the remarkable staff that work within these ministries, who are risking their lives to ensure that life-saving medical equipment and food is distributed. But the important point here is that the nature of this conflict is one that necessitates built-up areas to fight because of the nature of the RSF, because it doesn't have the type of equipment. They can't fight on an open battlefield, like maybe we've seen in World War I or World War II, these kinds of conventional military conflicts. By the very nature of the RSF, this always will be one that is deeply embedded in urban context. And that, of course, is greatly worrying for the civilians, and why any conflict should end immediately, but why especially this is so devastating for the populace of Sudan. But before detailing some of the urban warfare in Khartoum, I just wanted to highlight how the war was also being constructed in the urban landscape long before it erupted in April 15. One notable indicator of the war yet to come was one of the most visible and largest construction projects that was underway over the past year. And this was the construction of a several kilometer concrete wall surrounding the military headquarters in the heart of Khartoum. And writing just a few days before the conflict broke out, Declan Walsh, who's a New York Times journalist, noted that the construction of this wall was first viewed as an effort by the military to forestall another popular revolution. And notably, just before the conflict broke out, Declan here is writing on April 6th, that it transformed to one about divisions inside the military, of course, namely the standoff between SAF and the RSF. Other indicators of the war to come were the movements of RSF troops into strategic positions around Khartoum, which, were very much circulating in the build-up. And also, it's long been known that Hemeti, who's the leader of the RSF, was buying up strategic positions within Khartoum. And, there's a lot of rumor and conjecture, and I would hope to see more analysis on the way in which the real estate sector was here militarized and very much placed at the heart of this conflict. And also etched into the built environment was the low stakes for Khartoum citizens in this brutal military war. You know, you wouldn't see the portraits of Hemeti or Burhan in the homes or shops of Khartoum. You wouldn't see military or RSF insignias frequent these spaces, or even the graffiti on the wall, apart from in a few deliberately propagandist ways. You know, this really is one that the civilians of Sudan and Khartoum and cities across the country are really just being the receiving end of, which is really stark in this conflict compared to others in the region. But now, of course, the war has entered their homes, public spaces, and streets in a very brutal way. This is just, again, to give those not so familiar with Khartoum and the conflict an overview of the way in which, in the first 2 weeks in particular, the conflict broke out. And this is Beam Reports, who did a very good job at documenting as a first cut some of the outbreaks. And you see, you know, that the epicenter is the meeting of the two Niles, of the white and the blue. And the airport, which was really the epicenter, and why places like Amarat, where I was living, was so heavily hit. But also you had the areas just north of the airports and where the presidential palace is, and Khartoum Nin, or Khartoum 2 area, which is also the home to the principal RSF base. Khartoum North, you know, which is also home to many factories and worker housing. And so, you know, I also want to stress that the images that you saw of my own home, you know, have really been replicated throughout the urban fabric. You know, this has been absolutely devastating to civilian housings that are effectively the battlefield for this conflict, and why it's so damaging to the civilian population. With the sprawling concrete city of Khartoum has been transformed into an urban battlefield, and Human Rights Watch have already issued a report on the way in which both SAF and RSF are using explosive weapons with wide area effects in populated areas, meaning that cafes, schools, hospitals, and the basic infrastructure that makes urban life possible, such as electricity, water, and roads, have all become critical targets, central targets, and why this becoming a protracted conflict will have a devastating impact, and the depths of which we are, I think, yet to reach, and why we really, really need this to stop now.
Thank you very much, Deen, and thank you all for your introductory comments. Before I open it up to the public, what I would like to do is ask you if you have any comments on what your colleagues have said, because sometimes when we're talking, you know, ideas pop up as we're hearing someone else talk about what's going on. So I'll just leave it up. If there's anything you want to add before we open it up, this is the time to do it.
Something that I think came across very clearly in my co-panelists' comments is how urban this conflict is, and how devastating. I mean, conflict anywhere is horrible, and the peripheries of Sudan have had really atrocious conflict lobbied at them by the members of SAF and RSF. But at the same time, that there are so many people in Khartoum, and that is the, you know, the economic engine of the country, can't be understated. In that, with whether it's the migration, the you know, the leaving of middle and upper class people, or the fleeing away from Khartoum to other parts of the country, sometimes back to where these people fled from initially because of prior bouts of violence. I think is going to have huge, you know, economic ramifications for years, if not decades, to come. Khartoum, right before this conflict, was, I think, considered a megacity. I remember I talked to census officials back in 2018, and they said that Khartoum was about 8 million people then. And so probably before, you know, April 15th was could have been upwards of 9 or 10 million. And so that so much economic activity is happening there. When we think about the rebuilding of Sudan, it's going to take years, if not decades, for people to feel comfortable back in Khartoum, for the city to get rebuilt. And I'm saying this not to take away from the humanitarian toll or to take away from all the conflict that's been happening in Sudan and in the peripheries since independence, but just in thinking about the magnitude of this effort and the magnitude of the rebuilding process is going to be something that we haven't really seen in this in Africa very recently. That oftentimes most conflicts are in the peripheries, affecting sparsely populated areas, and so this is just fundamentally different.
Thank you. So we have a couple of questions from the audience, and I have a couple of questions, but I'm going to turn first to one of the audience members who is a former colleague of mine, a retired historian by the name of John Weiss. Hi, John. He's asking, in your evaluation of the quality of reporting of international journalists, such as Lindsay Shuttle and Abdul Latif Dahir, for example. So basically, it's a question about how international journalists have been working. Of course, we know, and I'll just speaking from personal experience, the only place that I would find any kind of real reporting that is taking place on a consistent basis has been Al Jazeera. But again, I might not be aware of the biases that might come across in Al Jazeera's reporting as well. So can you, just based on your experience, tell us a little bit more about what you think about international journalists covering? And here he specifically mentions Lindsay Shuttle, I can't tell, and Abdul Latif Dahir.
Yeah, I mean, I think in general, I think you're right. Al Jazeera has been doing good kind of coverage and analysis. I think the BBC actually just set up an emergency radio station that I think is airing 2 hours a day in Sudan. There's a journalist, I think his name is either Muhammad or Muhannad Hashim, who's kind of helped to set that up, who's Sudanese himself. Yusra Al-Baghir has done some really great reporting. I mean, she just left, but she was in first Jeddah, then Port Sudan, then Khartoum, actually. And so there are, like, a lot of Sudanese journalists who are kind of doing great work. Matt Nashed is he's Egyptian, but has been reporting, doing sort of analysis on Sudan for a long time. I've been sort of looking at, following him. So I do think that you can find, sort of news that focuses on the right stories and good analysis. But I was more talking about sort of your average person in the United States. If they're turning on their TV, they're mostly just getting information about the evacuation of foreign nationals, which...
Yep.
I'm not interested so much in this whole, our lives matter too. I don't think we need to prove to anybody that we're human, but I think that there is a level at which, you compare this to the coverage of Ukraine and it's completely different, and so, I think there's this person from the New York Times that Dr. Weiss just mentioned. What's his name?
His name, Abdul Latif Dahir.
Yes. I mean, he's been in touch with me and with other people on the ground, sort of asking us what we've seen. So I think that's been great. I haven't followed, I think I saw one of his articles, which I thought was good in the New York Times, but better than the New York Times has usually covered things, I would say, which is not necessarily saying that much.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things that the revolution kind of enabled is more voices who are based in Sudan to emerge. I mean, Khulud Khair is one of them. She's a friend. There are many others who are speaking regularly in the media. In Canada, Khalid Madani has been doing a great job. He's a friend and colleague. So you have people who are Sudanese, have connections, they have family, they might have evacuated themselves, who are speaking to the media more. And that gives me, some hope. I think what we're still missing, though, is a perspective that is not an elite perspective, perhaps. And that's, of course, more complicated. I mean, somebody, I think, also asked, about how do we connect with the resistance committees. I think some of what's difficult about that is, I mean, yes, the non-hierarchical nature and, I mean, there's so many people, even in my own family and kind of circle of friends, that are connected to these resistance committees. So it's also hard to know, like, who do you then contact? But I think it's also about the fact that they're doing this critical life-saving work and really trying to save people at the moment, rather than necessarily speaking to foreign reporters. And there's also issues with internet connectivity. I mean, I didn't have internet for most of the time that I was there. I mean, I did have some sporadic, but not like, you know, you have to having to be very careful about how you use it, because, you know, you might run out and the electricity might run out and so forth. So there's a kind of class element to this as well that I think is important to recognize.
Thank you very much. We have several questions. Deen, do you want to add anything to this?
Just 2 quick points. One is certainly it's a travesty that most of the major outlets did not have a full-time journalist on the ground in Khartoum before the war. Like, most of the correspondents you'll see are reporting either from Nairobi or other places in the region, and not Khartoum itself. And as I say, that's a phenomenon that started before. But then the second point to that is that it was, although it was quite possible for journalists and people like myself to be in Khartoum, I can tell you, I could never get a travel permit to travel outside of Khartoum that I'm required as a non-Sudanese. And that's the same for journalists. So, you know, there's, on the one hand, lots more definitely could have been done. But on the other hand, there was a repressive apparatus deliberately suppressing the reporting of places like Darfur and the country more broadly.
Thank you. We have a question from another colleague of mine, Professor Esra Akjan. She says, thank you very much for your presentations. My thoughts are with you, your family, and everyone who is impacted by this brutal conflict. She has 2 questions. The first one is, could you please talk a bit about the history of civil society organizations in Sudan? What are the groups with a longer history of experience and relative success? How much conversation and solidarity are there between pro-democracy organizations on the ground? That would be the first question, and I think Professor Hassan can talk to this, but let me read the second question, which I think is directed to Professor Sharp, about the urban warfare. Khartoum, Omdurman, and North Khartoum can be easily isolated from each other by the armed blocking of bridges over the Nile. Is this the case in this conflict? Are these forces that want to divide the city by blocking the transportation across these bridges? And what are the conditions, and this is a question that is close to my heart as well, of buildings at the University of Khartoum?
Great, thanks so much for that question. So, you know, the history of civil society organizations in Sudan, and specifically in resisting autocracy, is a really rich and storied one. Sudan had popular uprisings in 1964, in 1985, and a lot of these were based in the capital in Khartoum, and they were really led by professionals, by doctors, by journalists, by lawyers. Some of them who were in, you know, unions, other people who were just professionals and just had social linkages, whether it's, you know, relationships that they had with other doctors or such from college or in workplace environments. But in both of those instances, they were able to mobilize large amounts of people, get them out onto the streets, stay there for days, and then, you know, eventually overthrowing these military dictators. And so in thinking about the Bashir regime that came to power in 1989, you know, I think Bashir, especially in the wake of the hadn't quite recent 1985 uprising, I'm sure thinking about these professional organizations was fresh in his mind about how, you know, these formal groups with hierarchy, with formal membership, with, you know, that have like minutes and meetings and all the like, was on his mind as to, well, this is a way that people have overthrown autocracies in the past here in Sudan. How do I make sure that this does not happen to me in the future? And so, you know, he was a smart guy, horrible to say, but he was in power for nearly 30 years. And so I think he did a lot to really demobilize and really neuter a lot of the formal civil society groups in Sudan that had shown the ability to stop autocracy in the past. And so organizations that were effective in the past, precisely because they were effective, ended up not being effective because they ended up being targets for the Bashir regime. And so here, most people talk about unions, but also people think about political parties. And something that you asked how much conversation and solidarity are there between pro-democracy organizations? Oh, this is, if you ask people who study civil society in Sudan, man, it is a mess. The formal civil society landscape, so like the named organizations, that group is a mess. And it's crazy. These people all like hated the Bashir regime so viscerally. It's like, why can't you get together? I went to a lot of these workshops with opposition activists, leaders of these political parties, leaders with rebel movements. And, my training in political science and, existing theories and practical work, there's, to overthrow a dictatorship, you need unity, you need opposition unity. So I kept stressing that to them. And I was very naive at the beginning. And then I started seeing all the differences between them. They tried a few times to come together. So as an example, I'll read this here. So looking at attempts at, I just wrote this in a recent paper, just looking at opposition attempts at unity before the 1819 revolution, but since 2011, since the Arab Spring, we have an amalgamation of the country's major armed, the Revolutionary Front, the amalgamation of the country's armed groups, the signing of the New Dawn Charter in 2012, which endeavored to unify armed and civilian opposition to al-Bashir. And then we have the Sudan Call Alliance of 2015 that attempted again to unify the opposition by also including civil society groups. And so there were these huge conferences trying to bring people together, but oftentimes either they had completely different ideological ideas, like some, the communists and the Baathists who were completely secular versus many parties in Sudan are still like based off of Sufi orders or off of other religious tenets. But then also, in addition, they're not doing this in a vacuum. The Bashir regime recognizes that these people are trying to unify against him. And so it's very easy for the regime to temper up, ramp up elements of co-optation for some regimes, for some parties, and say, well, I know that you're joining this revolutionary front, but what if I gave you a seat in the government today, or if I gave you all of these resources right now, as opposed to so that you stop joining this coalition. And so there were attempts to bridge these groups together, but fundamentally the Bashir regime, because it was all done, most of it was so done out in the public by nature of these formal named groups, they were easy targets in a sense for the Bashir regime. And I'll stop there.
Just to answer the question on the bridges, yes, they've definitely been very central, but it's not so much wanting to block transport across bridges, but rather control transport through the bridges, whether that be, the SAF RSF being very important then to the mobility, as you say, across these different segments of the city, which are all critical. The other comment I'll make as well is that with these ceasefires, especially the first two, it's important to, in a personal experience of someone I know, that when they heard there was a ceasefire, that thought that then it was safe to cross the bridge. And of course it was not, because the ceasefire did not hold and it was shot. Luckily, they were attended to by a doctor, which was a miracle, to be honest, given the strain on getting to a doctor, and was attended to and is healing now. But, just to also show the real life implications of declaring ceasefires that you really know are not going to hold, and the implications that have for everyday civilians who think that when a ceasefire has been called, that means the fighting has stopped. And that clearly wasn't the case. And then we've seen it again and again and again, when I think it's very clear to everyone that these ceasefires are not worth the paper they're written on. And that there's a lot more political work that goes on before a credible ceasefire can be put in place. And my frustration is that not enough has been done in terms of the political pressure to be mobilized for a credible ceasefire to be put in place.
Thank you. We have a question from one of my students. Love it. Fedor Merkulov asks, it appears that the only feasible way of getting civilian groups a place at the negotiating table is through international pressure or involvement on their behalf. Does the international community benefit from standing back and letting this conflict turn into a protracted conflict? Why are they not interfering, essentially? And I want to add to this, in your opinion, is there such a thing as a member of the international community that could be considered in Sudan as an honest broker? Of course, a lot of people have weighed on this, the Saudis and the Emiratis and the Egyptians, and but who do you see as a possible a political party from outside that can come and act as an honest broker, if there's such a thing?
Yeah, I mean, this is a question that I'm grappling with, to be honest, so I'm not sure I can really answer it. But I mean, I think in terms of, I've asked myself, is there an interest, like, do some of these members of the international community benefit from standing back and kind of letting this fighting continue and evolve into a kind of protracted conflict? And I think the answer to that, unfortunately, is yes. I think there's ways in which international actors are interested in Sudan's oil, in the port and strategic kind of position at the Red Sea. We recently had a kind of deal signed between the Emiratis in partnership with a Sudanese multimillionaire called Osama Dawood, for the construction of a $6 billion port project along the Red Sea. You have all kinds of mining and other kinds of interests there. So I think there is, to me, a level at which some international actors at least think that they might benefit from this. At the same time, I mean, Sudan borders 7 countries, and any kind of protracted, conflict, war is likely going to spill over and have impacts on, if I think about Eritrea, Ethiopia, it's just kind of starting to stabilize. Like, what impact might that have, right? And so, I mean, I think I don't want to let myself, I guess, go there to think that there are certain, especially corporate interests that, like everywhere else on the continent, if you think about the Congo, for example, right, where instability and sort of conflict actually allows for kind of more effective extraction, if you will. I'm really allowing myself to get there, to think about that. I think for me, I mean, even though UNITAMS, I don't think played a great role in negotiating, I do think that it's the multilateral agencies that need to be backed in kind of brokering what happens in the future. I think the most important thing is that the Sudanese people that have been sidelined in the past, really since the December Revolution, need to be listened to. Any type of international engagement needs to be truly Sudanese led, and that has not happened thus far. I mean, there have been some elites, obviously, on the civilian and the FFC side who have been involved in this, but as Dr. Hassan was saying, they don't really represent the majority of the people anymore. And that's to great disappointment. So I think there's things that we as Sudanese have to figure out, and we are the ones who need to guide the next steps. I'm not in a position, I'm not a political analyst, I'm sitting in the diaspora to lay out what that looks like, but I'm going to be supporting whoever is on the ground demanding a transition to full civilian rule, and has been for a long time.
Yeah, I agree with everything that was said. Just really don't want to go down the path of thinking about those that may benefit from standing back, because I hope that it's not the case. I don't think it is, but certainly internationally we're in a very dark place, and we need to drag it to a better one.
Yes. So there is a question that is a very simple question that is asking whether do you see the U.S. as being the best leader to make things go back to normal? I'm not sure what normal is, but I have to ask that question because it's been asked. So I think I know your answer, but I would love to hear it from you.
Well, I think Professor Elamin already, kind of answered it in the sense that there are the multilateral agencies. They have a Security Council mandate. UNITAMS does exist. They've got the ability. They've certainly made mistakes, and clearly wouldn't have got to this point otherwise. But there is an infrastructure there that does make them the best actor to do that international support work that should be utilized and refocused with urgency.
Yeah, I think, Sorry, the only thing I would add is to say that the US doesn't have the kind of power that people might assume it does in Sudan. And part of this has to do with the kind of sanctions regime that was, imposed starting during the Clinton era. And, I think its allies do, like the Saudis and the Emiratis. One of the things that I've observed over the last, just thinking, in terms of the Biden administration, is that their policy towards Africa has been really sort of, it's basically about, countering the malign activities of Russia and China on the continent, and not a kind of any real engagement with, like taking seriously people's sovereignty and kind of demands, etc. And so to me, that's concerning, is that the Biden administration's Africa policy has not been great at all. And so with that kind of, vision to counter Russia and China, that's not the right way to engage with this. So yeah, I don't know. I think for me, there are they can apply pressure though to their allies. Certainly, there's definitely ways to do that. Yeah, and they haven't done that.
I see. I guess a follow-up to this is: do you see the African Union as has a role to play here, especially since people have been talking a lot about how the conflict, if it continues, might and will spill over to regions that border Sudan in one way or another. So do you see the African Union as having any role, or is it the same as the United States, where they've been kind of like, not as involved, particularly in Sudan's internal affairs, the way they are in other places in Africa?
They have been active on the political scene in Sudan. They definitely have an important role to play. And as Professor Elamin was mentioning earlier, with the regional dimensions and the implications. But to be honest, I think every actor has an important role to play. This is a moment where all hands need to be on deck. One, to stop the immediate violence that is underway at the moment, and then secondly, to figure out then how to get Sudan into a situation where it's not ruled or dictated to by these tyrants who've shown quite clearly that they do not have any regard for the civilian population.
Yeah, I think to me, I haven't been the African Union has played, to me, a somewhat disappointing role in the past. They issue statements, but there's not a whole lot of action behind it always, often. And this is earlier on, but I think in the present, what needs to happen really is to kind of build the capacity and sort of authority, if you will, of the African Union. I think the external actors need to support that kind of multilateral agency to precisely fill in a gap here, right? And that hasn't really happened. And so, I'm struck by the fact that it's the South Sudanese that are currently, trying to get at least, some form of negotiation / ceasefire, cessation of violence in place. Again, I think a lot of us don't want these two generals to be at the negotiation table, but we do need this fighting to stop for us to get to any other step. And they've also opened the border. To me, that is, given that this is a country that, experienced 2 million people, mostly from South Sudan, died in the Sudanese civil war, and the fact that they're the kind of actor here who's taking at least a step here is something that the international community should be ashamed of on some level, that they're not doing more. I don't know what Dr. Sharp thinks, but that's something that I've been struck by. And yeah, ideally, I think these multilateral agencies would be the kind of channel through which these things happen, but they also have, we've seen in the past that they've also been relatively paralyzed is not the right word, but like powerless on some level to really implement anything because of the influence of external actors. Yeah.
Okay. So we only have a few more minutes, and I'm going to ask you to do something that I know as scholars you hate to do, which is try and look into the future a little bit, and tell us based on your observation of what's happening there. What do you see happening in the near future and in the not so near future? Do you see the conflict ceasing anytime soon? How do you see this actually developing over the next few weeks?
I mean, I'm going to get emotional because I have my family still there.
Absolutely, yeah.
This has to stop. Like, there's no other option. I mean, it's not, we don't really have the privilege to lose hope, and I think, there needs to be a coordinated, unified international response to stop these war criminals, they're fighting, that we're all caught up in. And, I have a lot of hope in the Sudanese people. I mean, this is like a sort of very general comment here, but, I think once fighting stops and, there's some relative normalcy that returns, we can then look at, the mistakes that have been made that sort of got us to this point. For me, I think as somebody sitting outside, I want to see less international intervention moving forward of the kind that we've seen thus far, right? Of the kind that has been damaging. In some ways, I think, I think about Haiti in relation to this too, like sort of hands off Haiti, also hands off Sudan on some level. Not to say, I mean, the tentacles are so deeply in Sudan that it will be hard to figure out how to shift that involvement. But the kind of negative engagement that we've had so far needs to absolutely stop. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm not optimistic. I think I've been clear about that, but I think what Professor Elamin was saying, that it's absolutely, the Sudanese have shown, the resistance committees have shown a remarkable ability to organize under unspeakable pressure, circumstances, violence, outright violence. It's humbling. So I also don't and will not go into an absolutely dystopic place, but I do think, there needs to be a realization that this does have a real risk of being a long, brutal and protracted conflict without action, and that there is the ability to prevent that. And so I think that we do need to sketch this very clear picture that if those with power, if they do not pull their finger out, then it will have dire consequences. So, that's why I do think it's important, if you do have a senator that you can write to, if you do have a politician that is in a position of power to write to, do it, because they are the people that have the ability to leverage power that needs to be enacted to stop this brutal war that could get ever more dire. And I think that's an important message to communicate, despite how hard it is to do.
Thank you very much. These are perfect words to end our discussion today. I want to thank you from the bottom of my heart for taking the time.
Thanks for listening to this week's episode of Ufahamu Africa. You can find more episodes, show notes, and transcripts on our website, ufahamuafrica.com. This podcast is produced and managed by Megan DeMint, with help from production assistants Chukwufunanya Ikechukwu, Alex Kozak, and Ami Tamaklo. Our non-resident podcast fellows are Bamba Njaye, Maseke Rioba, Takono Priscilla Sempere, and Kamohelo Tanyiko Toledi. We are generously supported by the Carnegie Corporation of New York and receive research assistance from Cornell University and the University of California, Riverside. Our music is courtesy of Kevin McLeod. Until next week, Safiri Salama.